Hi-Fi Rush. Those are probably not the first two words you were expecting in a video about The Evil Within. Hi-Fi Rush was a surprise hit last year that came out of nowhere. A linear, rhythm-based action game with a comic art style. And which studio made it? Oh yeah, naturally the one known for dark and brutal horror games, The Evil Within. And Ghostwire Tokyo, I guess. Talk about a drastic shift in direction. I played the first few hours of The Evil Within many years ago for rocky framerate on the PS4, and even though I found the atmosphere gripping, I left it in the dust and moved on. Ever since then, I've been meaning to give it a second chance, especially once I got into probably the most comparable series of games, Resident Evil. I recently played and finished Hi-Fi Rush, and since almost every part of it was practically perfect, I knew that now would be the best time to finally give The Evil Within another try, to see if maybe it's actually on a similar level. Hi, I'm Jerry. Welcome to A Second Chance, where I revisit games I tried someday but could not connect with. Games that have lingered in my mind and made me wonder if another push was all I needed. Some of my favorite games are ones that I did not like at first. I even hated some of them, in fact. A second chance can do wonders, and today I want to see if it can do that for Tango Gameworks' The Evil Within. The survival horror genre has thinned out in the AAA space over the past decade and more. Practically the only big franchise that has managed to keep its footing, and only through risky reinvention, is Resident Evil. It's definitely inspiring other companies to revive old franchises like Dead Space, which got a fantastic remake only to be left in the dust again, and Silent Hill, which is getting a questionable looking remake of its second installment. Still, there are a good few attempts to revitalize the survival horror genre in the wake of the success of Resident Evil, Alan Wake 2 and The Outlast Trials, for example. And in the indie space, of course, it's been thriving for years, a common trend for many genres. How does The Evil Within fit into all of this? The first game came out in 2014, and it clearly followed in the footsteps of earlier Resident Evil games. The project was even led by Shinji Mikami, who either directed or produced every main RE game up until and including Resident Evil 4. While the term survival horror has been broadened over the years, the first, The Evil Within, generally fits into classic conventions. There's limited ammo, limited health, every enemy poses a threat and makes you consider your resources carefully. It gives you ways to defend yourself, but the scarcity of items and not quite snappy controls are where the tension lies. In some ways, however, The Evil Within also resembles later Resident Evil games like 5 and 6, namely through its insane set pieces. The lines between survival horror and full-on action constantly blur in this game. Just take a look at this. But let us take a step back for a moment. What is The Evil Within actually about? You play as Sebastian Castellanos, a detective finding himself on his way to investigate an incident in a mental hospital. Once he gets there, all kinds of supernatural things start happening. A mysterious figure in ragged clothes teleports and murders policemen. Sebastian is knocked out and finds himself in a butcher's cellar that he has to find a way out of. Once he gets back to the main level of the hospital, the city around the hospital starts shaking, and Sebastian, his comrades and a few other characters make a narrow escape through a crumbling metropolis before...
Look out!
After this wild intro, the game leads you through a distorted world where all kinds of insane things happen with no direct explanations, slowly introducing you to its systems of combat, of stealth, gathering resources and exploring its levels. It becomes a mix of slow, methodical survival horror and fast-paced action, constantly sprinkling in new locations and set pieces, making you never feel too safe or sure of your surroundings. Despite all the similarities, just calling The Evil Within a clone of Resident Evil doesn't do it justice, because it feels very different to play it actually. To see why, let's dive into my experience of revisiting it and giving it another chance. When I first played this game nearly 6 years ago, I had never played any survival horror game before, and not a whole lot of horror games in general. Games like Outlast had me scared shitless, and I remember that I was absolutely terrified by the first few levels after the intro in The Evil Within. I never got very far, but I vividly remember the encounter with the sadist in the village, who keeps roaring and roaring in the background while you explore it, until finally you have to fight him. It took me a lot of patience and nerves to finally bring him down, but bring him down I did, and it was extremely rewarding. So what did I do after that nerve-wracking and euphoric experience? Yeah, I kinda dropped the game. I think I just didn't want to handle that level of tension and stress. I really wasn't too good at games like these in those days, and how could I have been? It was the first survival horror game that I had ever played. It took me a few more years to really get into more horror games. First and foremost, of course, Resident Evil, of which I have played almost a dozen games by now, but also the first 2 Dead Space games, Bloodborne, both the Last of Us titles and more. These are not all survival horror games by the standards of purists, but they sure are horror, and definitely got me used to that level of tension. Equipped with all this experience, I knew it was time to revisit the first one I had played, to push through and finally see what it has to offer. So, was it worth it? Well, it's complicated. Let's start right at the beginning. The opening hours of this game are some of its strongest, from the batshit insane set pieces at the start to the super atmospheric, intense exploration of the wilderness, the village. I remembered all of this, but I did not remember it to be so strong, so atmospheric. Also, to my surprise, I found this part to be much easier this time around and not nearly as challenging as before. The gameplay also felt smoother, though eventually the cracks would start to show, but we'll get to that. The one thing that still lived on in my mind most predominantly after all these years was the use of a slightly grainy version of Clair de Lune as a save room theme, one of the most popular and iconic pieces of music ever made, and yeah, it works wonders here, fitting perfectly into the dreamlike atmosphere.
She's gone.
Coming back to the village level, that's what I expected most of the game to be like, structurally. Kind of akin to the interweaving level design of Resident Evil, just a bit more condensed with more linear set pieces sprinkled in. I was surprised then that the game is extremely linear most of the time. Personally, I don't find that to be an inherent issue in games. The opposite, in fact. It can be used to great effect. And in certain moments of this game, it is. There isn't any of the backtracking or relatively static level design of Resident Evil, making the progression of working through this game's world not nearly as clear as any level could drastically change right in front of you at any time. That really works in its favor. Unfortunately, the quality in level design and set pieces fluctuates drastically. At some point, the set pieces start to become repetitive. The level design starts to grate. As I said, there are highlights here, such as the mansion level, an obvious callback to RE1, but it's inconsistent. On a general gameplay front, it's also a mixed bag, unfortunately. The movement and shooting is decent, and you never feel comfortable enough to feel totally safe, which is important in a game like this, right? However, the level of zoom when you aim down sights, combined with enemies that can move extremely quickly, is a very annoying combination. For the amount of enemies the game expects you to take down, the ammo economy also feels too stingy, especially in later levels. So the balance between survival horror and the action bits is not balanced within the ammo that you get. I might also just not be very good, that's also a factor possibly. But lastly, it's absolutely ridiculous how many things can stun lock or even instantly kill you in this game. It gets old very fast, and it's not just bosses but also regular enemies sometimes. But it really isn't all negative either. The bosses are actually quite solid. I won't spoil any of the later ones, but there are some really good ones here that are memorable. You know what's memorable too? The story. Kind of. There's really not much of it, and from what I hear it only really starts coming together through the DLCs with Kidman, but at least conceptually there are some really cool ideas here. And I really do mean ideas, because the actual characters and execution of the story leave a lot to be desired. Sebastian Castellanos doesn't have any depth apart from some tacked on collectible lore and is really irrelevant to the story itself. He's just an observer really. All of the other characters are forgettable too, the only exception being the antagonist Ruvik. I'm going to get into some spoilers here for a minute, so skip ahead if you want to avoid that. I love this idea of a simulation of people's brains connecting together as a horror setting, and how the closer you get to the core of who Ruvik is, the more he tries to stop you, as he's the core of the simulation as well. But again, it's all half-baked and never fully realizes its potential. I'm all for leaving questions open-ended, but there really needed to be more substance here. It feels like this idea of a simulation is often just used to excuse complete nonsense and things just happening. Some of the bosses are clearly connected to Ruvik, but others just exist for some reason. The same goes for the levels and environments in general. The game's unpredictability is entertaining for sure, but once you realize that it's nonsense and there's no pattern to it really, it starts to lose its appeal. It's such a cool idea to have this world be a twisted version of the memories and thoughts and nightmares of the characters connected to the simulation, but the evil within doesn't really care for cohesion or depth in the slightest. There's so much potential and so much of it is sadly wasted. Even though there's not enough meat on the story, it still picks up towards the end, as you learn more about Ruvik and his backstory and how he became the madman that he is. Kidman as well becomes fascinating when she starts showing ulterior motives that I think are probably more explored in the DLCs, which makes me very curious about them. I also really like the ending, when Sebastian wakes up from a simulation and walks out from a hospital, clueless cops swarming around him who have no idea what happened. I think that's a really great moment and honestly a perfect way to finish off this story. Overall, I enjoyed The Evil Within. Despite how my review may have sounded, the craziness that never lets up is a wild ride of set piece after set piece, but too many half-baked ideas, inconsistent execution, and identity issues really made me leave this game feeling rather underwhelmed. Its high points will stick in my mind for sure, but so will its many moments of mediocrity and frustration. Ultimately, this game is just okay, decent in my mind, a 6 out of 10 if you want to put a number on it. It's fascinating to see how far the studio has come from The Evil Within to Hi-Fi Rush, and I might check out the DLCs as well as the sequel The Evil Within 2. For now though, let me know what you think about this game, the studio, and maybe what your experience with survival horror games in general has been like. That's it from me, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.